Hello, everybody, and welcome to yet another episode of Forgotten and Found, where we will be talking about the first serial killer in history. True crime is a big business in the 21st century. The true crime genre includes books, television shows, podcasts, documentaries, and even annual conventions. Over half of Americans claim to enjoy true crime, and 13% of people say it is their favorite genre. For some reason, people seem to love hearing about the heinous actions of others. But for the thousands of hours of true crime material out there, few people seem to have tuned into the actions of one Gilles de Rais. Gilles de Rais is considered by many to be the first true serial killer in history. He was a contemporary of Joan of Arc and was a hero for a long time during the 100 Years' War. There have likely been many more serial killers before the rise of Gilles de Rais, but de Rais embodies the modern image of a serial killer better than anyone else in the early historical record. De Rais has a particular profile for his murders. He also has a compelling story that gave rise to his behaviors. These two things combine to elevate de Rais from a typical madman to that of a tried and true serial killer of the highest order. So what was the profile of Gilles de Rais? What caused him to kill? How did he fall from grace? How does Joan of Arc play into all of this? These are the questions that we will be setting out to answer. And just like our previous episode, the actions of Gilles de Rais turn out to be far darker than most people realize. His fall is swift, and his unraveling is alarming. The story of Gilles de Rais is one that caused me to pause and read it again to ensure that I had read it correctly the first time. It is one of those stories that caused me to immediately ask, why have I not heard about this before? It has all of the hallmarks of a great tale. It has a dashing hero who seems to be on the precipice of having it all. It involves one of history's most recognizable figures in Joan of Arc, and it includes a stunning fall from grace and a turn into the ultimate villain. Why had I not read a book about this? Why haven't I seen a documentary? As soon as I discovered this tidbit, I knew I had to share it. It is a story too good to sit on. So settle in as we unpack the story of Gilles de Rais, including all of the sordid details. This story is a perfect blend of history and true crime, and the events are sure to shock you. I know they shocked me. Let us find out together who Gilles de Rais was, how he became entangled with Joan of Arc, and how that entanglement ultimately caused him to unravel and become one of history's most wretched monsters. Gilles de Rais was born around 1405 into the powerful Montmorency-Laval family, one of the wealthiest and most influential noble houses in Brittany. Brittany had recently emerged from a civil war of its own, and the victors had managed to consolidate the wealth and power of the region into the hands of a number of victorious houses. Gilles de Rais was born into one of these. His early years were marked by both privilege and tragedy. His mother, Marie de Craon, dies at an unknown date when he was a young child. His father, Guy de Laval, died shortly after, leaving him parentless. He was placed under the guardianship of his maternal grandfather, Jean de Craon. Jean was a ruthless and ambitious noble and ensured that his grandson received a thorough education in courtly etiquette, military strategy, and classical knowledge. But he was also instilled with a dangerous sense of entitlement and unbridled ambition. Jean de Craon flouted the will of Giles's father and feverishly worked to arrange a beneficial betrothal for Gilles. De Craon was so strict in his treatment of Gilles de Rais because his own heirs had perished in the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. Gilles de Rais was the only remaining heir for Jean de Craon and his familial line. From an early age, Gilles demonstrated remarkable skill as a warrior and as a commander. As France was engulfed in the 100 Years' War against England and his Burgundian allies, he quickly proved himself on the battlefield. By his late teens, he had gained the reputation for both being reckless and effective in combat, qualities that made him a valuable asset to the beleaguered French cause. His family's immense wealth allowed him to live extravagantly, and his grandfather arranged a lucrative marriage to Catherine de Thouars, his cousin, which significantly expanded his holdings. This was the third attempt to get Gilles married, with the first two attempts failing for various reasons. With the marriage to Catherine de Thouars, Gilles de Rais becomes one of the wealthiest men in France, possessing vast estates in Brittany, Anjou, and Poitou. With his fortune, he indulged in a lifestyle of excess, surrounding himself with artists, scholars, and lavish displays of wealth. Yet despite his opulent tastes, he remained a warrior at heart, eager for greater glory. Gilles de Rais began to fight for French interests beginning in 1423 at the age of 17. He fought in a number of battles between 1423 and 1425, but the French are doing poorly. In an army beset by poor leadership and few victories, the military prowess of de Rais, coupled with his substantial wealth centered in Brittany, caused him to stand out like a bright star in a sea of night. It was during this period that he entered the orbit of Charles VII, the Dauphin of France, whose tenuous claim to the throne was imperiled by English dominance. Looking for skillful allies, Charles VII quickly takes Gilles de Rais into his court and heaps praise and responsibility upon him. Still in his early 20s, de Rais seems to be a rising star in the French military. He seems poised to take a leap in French society, but in order to do so, the French must recover from the disastrous decade of military setbacks that have befallen them. In 1429, as France's situation grew dire, word began to spread of a remarkable young woman from Lorraine, Joan of Arc, who claimed divine visions, had called her to lead France to victory. When Joan was brought to Chinon to meet Charles VII, Gilles de Rais was among the nobles who observed her. He was captivated, not only by her faith, but also by the promise she represented, a chance to achieve immortal glory on the battlefield. In Joan, de Rais saw the key to French victory, and therefore the key to his ultimate rise to power. With Joan and through Joan, de Rais could complete the French comeback envisioned by Charles VII and entrench himself as one of the most powerful lords of the resurgent nation. The rising paths of Gilles de Rais and Joan of Arc crossed during the final years of the 100 Years' War, when both were serving under the banner of Charles VII of France, and de Rais saw much in the young maiden. Their relationship, while historically unclear in its deeper nuances, was forged on the battlefield and defined by a mix of admiration, shared military triumphs, and perhaps a certain obsessive devotion on de Rais's part. To him, Joan was a symbol, but also a tool. She was also an enigma and could have been the source of jealousy. Gilles de Rais, as mentioned, was already an experienced military commander when Joan of Arc emerged in 1429, claiming divine guidance in her mission to lift the siege of Orleans and secure Charles VII's coronation. When Joan arrived at Charles VII's court and began her campaign, de Rais was one of the high-ranking captains assigned to her forces and was seemingly one of the influential voices who elevated Joan from an oddity into something far more legitimate. It is likely that de Rais used his influence to ensure that he and his men would accompany Joan on her military campaigns. He fought alongside her at the Siege of Orleans, where her unorthodox tactics and fervent leadership reinvigorated the French troops, including de Rais himself. De Rais was reportedly captivated by her presence, possibly seeing her as a holy figure, someone who embodied divine purpose, in contrast to his own reputation for excess and cruelty. But in the light of later evidence and incidents, it is possible that de Rais's interest in Joan was far darker and more insidious than most people at the time realized. Joan was nearly a perfect foil for de Rais. She was a young woman, a peasant, and someone utterly devoted to God. She had no military background, no wealth, and no master other than God himself. De Rais was a man of noble birth. He had grown up fighting. He had untold amounts of wealth, and had numerous masters, from his late father to his grandfather and now the king. The fact that Joan managed to end up in the same position as him in 1429 while coming from a completely different and alien background must have been fascinating or possibly infuriating. De Rais quickly becomes Joan's closest ally, accompanying her through the Loire Valley campaign and the decisive battle of Patay. De Rais spent time ingratiating himself to Joan and seemingly believed that Joan's rise could help elevate his own status and house. He was also among the commanders who led her forces during the march to Reims, culminating in Charles VII's coronation in July of 1429. His loyalty to Joan was rewarded with the prestigious title Marshal of France. On that day, Charles, Joan, and Gilles all seem to get exactly what they want. Charles is crowned, Joan's mission is complete, Gilles is awarded the highest military title in the land. It is an absolute triumph. And it could have, and should have, ended at that. But history is not so neat and tidy. There is no direct evidence that the relationship between Gilles and Joan went beyond the battlefield, but many historians speculate that de Rais may have had a near-religious obsession with Joan. She embodied everything that he did not: purity, divine certainty, and unwavering faith. Some accounts suggest that de Rais saw her as a symbol of redemption, while others argue that he was simply enthralled by her charisma and military genius, or perhaps her age and her beauty. Given his later descent into depravity, it is tempting to view his connection to Joan as a stark contrast between idealism and corruption. It is also documented around this time that de Rais began to have severe concerns about the state of his soul and his own salvation. Whether these feelings were prompted by Joan's religious zeal or were simply focused by it is hard to say, but through Joan, Gilles becomes more aware of his own shortcomings and place in the divine plan for France. Their association effectively ends with Joan's capture at Compiègne in May of 1430. Unlike other high-ranking French nobles who made efforts, however weak, to ransom or rescue her, de Rais disappears from the historical record concerning her fate. Whether he was unable or unwilling to intervene is unknown, but after her execution in May of 1431, his military career waned. Joan, after being such a powerful symbol and near constant companion for over a year, is ripped away from de Rais in an instant. Joan's death may have had a profound psychological effect on him. Some historians suggest that her execution marked a turning point in his life, accelerating his descent into the infamous acts of depravity for which he is ultimately remembered. Having lost the one figure who may have inspired genuine reverence in him, de Rais seems to have abandoned all restraint, retreating to his chateau where he engaged in unspeakable crimes. De Rais's crimes seem to have been elevating a mortal person to the heights of godhood. Seeing someone as infallible, as holy, as divine, and then seeing that same person cast aside, abandoned, and ultimately executed would shake anyone's faith. Why didn't God save his chosen vessel? Why didn't the crown do more to save their heroine? Why couldn't de Rais himself save her? The details are murky, but there is a definitive turning point in the saga of Gilles de Rais following the capture and execution of Joan of Arc. It is possible that de Rais's later excesses were, in part, a reaction to Joan's death, a twisted response to the loss of someone he might have seen as a saintly figure. Some theories even suggest that his latter occult dabblings were a desperate heretical attempt to reconnect with the divine forces that had seemingly abandoned him after her death. In the end, while their relationship was likely built on mutual respect and military necessity, it remains an open question whether de Rais saw Joan as a guiding light, a lost savior, or merely a passing figure in his life. But whatever she was, Joan left an indelible mark on his psyche. Joan of Arc is executed on May 30th, 1431. She is burned at the stake in Rouen after a year in custody and facing a hostile trial. After the death of Joan of Arc, the French military situation stabilizes and then improves. However, despite the strong position the French found themselves in 1431, that success does not translate to Gilles de Rais. After the events of 1431, de Rais's star begins to fade. He dumped large amounts of his personal wealth into the campaigns for Orleans and the march to Reims. The French crown was struggling with finances, and they were more than happy to allow de Rais to spend his own capital to expand their war effort. However, once the dust had settled, de Rais was now the one low on funds, and the crown seemed in no mood to compensate him for his troubles. Details about this period are hazy. Many of the details regarding the finances of Gilles de Rais come decades later from his disgruntled heirs, who were left with an unholy mess of an estate to deal with. What we do know is that de Rais's fortunes, both financial and political, were on the way down. Tensions between de Rais and the newly crowned Charles VII began to strain. The question of money and influence are likely to blame. Charles VII, as we discussed in our previous episode, was keen on consolidating his power at the expense of those at his court. It is likely that Charles VII could have seen de Rais as a rival. Gilles de Rais was a successful military commander and held the title of Marshal of France. He was also from an influential family that had its own designs for the future of France. By freezing out de Rais, Charles again neutralized another potential threat to his power. By the year 1435, it is clear to the French court that Gilles de Rais is no longer a player. He is described as being disgraced by the king. His house lost a substantial amount of influence and prestige in the aftermath of Joan of Arc's death. Gilles de Rais went from being at the pinnacle of French society to the outside looking in. He was close to the heroine of Joan of Arc, close to Charles VII, successful on the battlefield, and wealthy. He seemed like he was in a prime position to continue his ascendancy into the next phase of French history, but that didn't happen. De Rais becomes disillusioned with his position, and after he is expelled from the court in 1435, he retreats to his holdings and gradually fades from public life as he begins to pursue his own increasingly eclectic interests. Between 1435 and 1438, Gilles de Rais disappears into his various castles and chateaux. When he reappears, he has a new mission. De Rais buys the services of a questionable priest by the name of Eustache Blanchet, and tasks him with sending out a call to the surrounding lands. De Rais is no longer interested in military conquests or being a pillar of the French nobility. Instead, he asks Blanchet to find those wise in the ways of alchemy and demon summoning. These are two things that are absolutely forbidden by the church, and if any word of this was breathed to the king, it would damage whatever remaining credibility de Rais might have had at court. But despite the risks, de Rais ventures forward into the abyss. The fallen priest Blanchet finds an Italian clerk by the name of Francois Prelati, who claimed to be both an alchemist and proficient in the art of demon summoning. De Rais meets with Prelati, who shows him a trove of grimoires and scrolls containing information about the summoning rituals. Satisfied, de Rais brings Prelati to his castle at Tifauges and tasks him with summoning a demon by the name of Baron. It is unclear where the idea of summoning this exact demon came from. It is also unclear what exact motives de Rais has at this point. Some have suggested that de Rais was desperately seeking a way to regain the fame and fortune he had possessed in years prior. Others have suggested that de Rais was still clinging to his obsession with Joan of Arc and wanted the help of a demon to reconnect him with her spirit. Whatever the motivations, de Rais takes his first steps down the path that would ultimately destroy him. Under the guidance of Prelati, de Rais drafts a contract for the demon, which promises the spirit riches in exchange for something. Prelati then gets to work in the bowels of de Rais's castle, performing the summoning rituals. But as time went on, it became clear that Prelati was either a fraud or something was amiss, because no demon was forthcoming. De Rais berates Prelati and demands results. Prelati, either taking instructions from the dark spirits or making things up as he goes along, informs de Rais that the body parts of children are required to continue. At this point, de Rais has a choice. He can stop this whole endeavor and cut his losses, or he can dive deeper into depravity. He chooses the latter. In 1432, children begin disappearing from the lands of Gilles de Rais, and the experiments continue in earnest. However, despite offering the blood and remains of various children, the demon still is unwilling to cooperate. Prelati has failed. The failure leaves de Rais even more disillusioned and more impoverished than ever before. He has clearly dumped large amounts of his remaining fortune into the occult and has come up empty-handed. Years later, in the spring of 1440, likely due to increasing desperation and a lack of all respect for the church, de Rais does something unthinkable and unforgivable. He enters a church in the middle of Mass, under force of arms. He breaks up the service, kidnaps the priest, and many of the parishioners are beaten. The action was the result of a dispute over a castle. De Rais had turned one of his castles over to a different party in 1434, but then decided to reclaim the castle, likely due to financial hardship, in 1439. However, the local priest, Jean de Ferron, resisted the move and declared it illegal. This enraged de Rais, who retaliated by kidnapping Le Ferron. This was the last straw for local officials. After rumors of disappearing children, black magic, and rape, de Rais has finally brought himself into the light with his brash actions against the priest. An inquisitional investigation was opened into de Rais, and this spelled the beginning of the end to his reign of terror. De Rais has committed two obvious crimes with his raid on the church. He interrupted the administration of the sacraments, which was sacrilege, and he laid hands on the ducal servants and parishioners. such blatant acts of violence and disregard for the law could not go unanswered. The investigation took all summer, but by September, a warrant was issued for his arrest. De Rais was ordered to appear at the local capital of Nantes to face charges of, quote, murdering children, sodomy, invoking demons, offending the divine majesty, and heresy. When he didn't appear, he was arrested on September 15th, 1440. De Rais was arrested alongside his confidants and co-conspirators, Blanchet and Prelati. De Rais was charged and tried by both a secular court of Brittany and the church's ecclesiastical court. Based on extensive testimony from both Blanchet and Prelati, who sold out their master in a vain attempt to save their own lives, De Rais was condemned to death. The ecclesiastical court put in the record that they suspected De Rais of being complicit in the murder of over 140 children, a staggering figure. The court also accused 2 of De Rais' servants of being complicit and 2 midwives who are accused of providing children and babies for the monstrous master of the castle. De Rais was condemned to die a 3-fold death, via hanging, burning, and stabbing, a special kind of punishment reserved for the worst of society. Since De Rais had broken both church law and civil law, he was condemned to die multiple deaths to atone for his crimes. De Rais, 2 of his servants, and Blanchet were all condemned to die, and by some stroke of luck or genius, Prelati, the orchestrator of the whole ordeal, managed to get life in prison rather than death. He later escaped, but was implicated in a different heinous scheme and was executed years later at a different court. The morning of October 26, 1440, dawned cold and gray over the city of Nantes. A heavy mist rolled off the Loire, curling around the high walls of the chateau where Gilles de Rais had spent his final wretched nights. Outside, a great crowd had gathered in the execution ground beyond the city walls, where the condemned were sent to meet their fate. Nobles, townfolk, monks, and beggars alike pressed together, eager to witness the fall of a man who had once stood among the highest in France. The scaffold was already in place, a towering pyre of dry wood stacked in preparation for the burning. At its base stood the gallows, its rope swaying lightly in the wind. A line of clergy, draped in black and murmuring prayers, their voices drowned out by the restless murmurs of the gathering throng. From the dungeons, Gilles de Rais emerged, flanked by 2 monks and a procession of armed guards. His once golden hair, now streaked with white, hung loose about his shoulders. He was clad in the simple robes of a condemned man, a stark contrast to the silken finery he had once worn in battle and at court. Despite the weight of his crimes, he walked with a noble bearing, as if stepping towards the executioner's block were merely another stage in some grim performance of his. At the foot of the scaffold, Gilles knelt before the priests, who offered him last rites. He listened intently, muttering his responses in a low voice, his hands clasped together. If he feared death, he did not show it. Instead, those who stood close enough to see his face remarked on his strange serenity, as though after years of self-inflicted horror, he was at last resigned to the justice of men and God. De Rais demanded that he be executed first, the first of many that would take place that day. His request was granted, and he implored those condemned with him to die good deaths in the eyes of their peers and of God. The executioner moved swiftly. Gilles was first hanged, his body jerking as the noose tightened around his neck. The once great lord, former Marshal of France, was reduced to a lifeless weight, swaying in the autumn air. His body was then pierced and cut down, dropped into the hungry flames below. The fire quickly consumed the robes before incinerating flesh and bone alike. The air filled with the acrid stench of burning hair, skin, and charred wood, in a final terrible offering to the heavens. And so Gilles de Rais was erased from the world, his legacy forever twisted by the crimes he had committed, his name consigned not to the halls of heroes, but to the blackest annals of infamy. Despite the nature of his crimes against the church and against God, de Rais was given the opportunity to partake in a confession. Instead of having his ashes scattered into the nearby river, as was standard practice for heretics, he was allowed to be buried, one last gesture toward his noble birth. Perhaps the unceasing mercy of God could blot out the overwhelming sins of de Rais' soul, or perhaps he sold that same soul to the devil during his dark experiments. No one knows for certain. All we know is that de Rais breathed his last on the execution grounds outside of Nantes and passed into the darkest annals of history forever. The story of Gilles de Rais is both shocking and moving. It is the story of a man who lost his mind before losing everything. He lived in a tumultuous and untimely tragic life. He was overcome by personal demons and then perhaps literal demons. His crimes are inexcusable, but his story is so compelling that it didn't take long for the peasantry to begin to exonerate him after his death. Some muttered that he had been tricked by Blanchet and Perlati. Some said he was the sacrifice to the demon that was summoned in the black chambers of de Rais' castle. Others felt bad for the man who had fallen so far. Some simply enjoyed seeing one of the nobility meet the same grisly end that they so often doled out to the peasantry. In the end, de Rais met the same fate as Joan of Arc, his obsession, his guiding light, and his heroine. Some have described this story as a tale of a saint and the devil. Two tragic figures fated to cross paths and fated to die in the same way. And that is history, once forgotten and now found. Thank you for listening to the ultimate episode of Forgotten and Found's inaugural season. We have learned a lot, both about history and about podcasting. I am thrilled to begin the second phase of this podcast's future. Season 2 will launch sometime in late March. The next season is titled Weird World War II, and we have some great topics to explore. The podcast is going to switch to a bi-weekly release schedule, which will allow me to elaborate on the scripts, add some things, and work on cleaning up the audio quality. All told, we expect Season 2 to be higher quality, bigger, and better than ever before, and we cannot wait to share it with you. We hope the increase in quality and the uniformity of topics across a season will help drive growth and interest. If you want to support my work, please consider supporting the podcast on Patreon. If you want to read more interesting history, please visit my blog at grantpiperwriting.medium.com. I post a new article daily covering a wide range of topics. We really hope to see you for Season 2, and until we cross paths again, be good and God bless.